The first time I truly understood the man across the hall could kill me without breaking a sweat, I was standing barefoot in the corridor at 2 in the morning, holding a shredded envelope with my new alias printed on it. I had come to Chicago to disappear from Preston Ainsworth, my former fiancé, a man who wore custom suits and destroyed people with zoning maps and quiet phone calls to state inspectors he owned. I had picked the 22nd floor of the old grain tower lofts on Lake Michigan because the concierge screened visitors like a Swiss vault, because the elevators required a fob at every floor, and because the building did not appear in any tenant registry a private investigator could subpoena in less than 9 months. What I did not know, as my neighbor's door opened behind me and a low, patient voice asked if I was all right, was that Matteo Bellondi ran the largest silent empire in the Midwest, and that the envelope in my hand had just placed my name inside it. He stood in the doorway of 22A without stepping out. He was tall, unhurried, dressed in a plain dark sweater and slacks that looked expensive only if you already knew fabric. His hair was cropped short, threaded with early gray at the temples, and there was a small chip on his front tooth I would later learn came from a fight in a warehouse in Gary, Indiana, when he was 22 years old and still trying to be the man his father wanted him to be. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked at the envelope in my hand, then at my face, and asked again, gently, if I was all right. I said yes. I lied. He nodded once, as if he already knew, and stepped back inside. The deadbolt on 22A clicked with the softness of a well-oiled hinge, and something in my chest refused to unclench for a long time. I had rented apartment 22B 6 weeks earlier under the name Elena Vance. My real last name I had left back in Evanston, along with a leased sedan, a wardrobe of pale silk blouses, and an engagement ring I had dropped into the Chicago River from the Wells Street Bridge on a windy Saturday in August. I was 34 years old, a forensic accountant with 11 years at a Big Four firm, and I had spent the last 2 years of my engagement watching Preston use permits, inspectors, and the polished cruelty of a man who never raised his voice to make my world smaller and smaller. When he began locking my passport in his desk drawer and standing in doorways I wanted to walk through, I understood that whatever came next would not stop at bruises. So I planned, quietly, for 8 months. I moved cash in small legal amounts. I copied documents I would need later. I memorized routines. And then, on a Tuesday morning while he was in Springfield meeting a state senator, I ran. The grain tower lofts had been my final splurge. The rent devoured the emergency fund I had built inside a credit union account in my mother's maiden name. But the building had a fob-only elevator, a night concierge named Reggie who had done 20 years as a Cook County deputy, and no ties to any tenant database Preston's investigators could reach. My days were quiet. I worked remotely for a small nonprofit that audited housing charities for fraud, a modest job that paid modestly and let me keep my name off any public roster. My evenings were quieter still. I bought groceries on foot from a small market 3 blocks north. I took different routes home each night. I learned the faces of the doormen at 3 neighboring buildings, so I would know when a stranger stood among them. And for the first month, I convinced myself that the silence of the 22nd floor meant I had finally won something back from him. Then the mail came. It was a routine envelope, forwarded through the mailbox service I used as a buffer, and it had arrived with the corner torn and the flap already loose. Inside was a single sheet with my alias, my floor number, and 1 printed line in a plain typeface. I always find what belongs to me, Elena. Preston had never called me Elena in his life. He called me by a shortened pet name I now refused to say out loud, which meant he had learned the new name I had chosen, which meant the buffer had leaked, or someone he paid had followed the paper, or one of the small favors he collected over the years had ripened into an answer he could use. My hand went cold around the sheet. I read the line 3 times. I checked the postmark, which was smudged past reading, and the return address, which was blank. I stood in my kitchen for a long minute with the sheet pinched between 2 fingers, and then I did the one stupid thing a trained woman like me should never have done. I stepped out into the corridor for air, in bare feet, with the envelope still in my hand, because the walls of 22B felt suddenly too close to my skin. And that was when I heard the door of 22A open behind me. Now, before I take you deeper into the man in 22A and the ledger that would soon link his life to mine in ways neither of us wanted, let me ask a small favor. If the opening of this story has already pulled you in, tap the like button and subscribe. It costs nothing. It tells the platform to show this story to other people who need a good long tale on a quiet night, and it keeps me writing them for you. Thank you. Now, back to Matteo Bellondi and the mistake I was about to make. In the days after the envelope, I did what any trained forensic accountant does when frightened. I made lists. I cataloged every stranger in the lobby. I noted the times the freight elevator moved. I logged the rhythms of my floor as if it were a client's cash flow. And that was when I began to notice Matteo. Not because he stood out, but because he almost never did. He came home at 11 at night. He left again at 4 in the morning. He never carried grocery bags. He never took a delivery. Twice a week, a black sedan with tinted rear windows waited for him in the loading bay, and the driver never once stepped out to open the door. He wore the same style of dark sweater in 3 different shades, and the only jewelry he owned appeared to be a thin steel band on his right index finger that looked more like a memory than an ornament. He was polite in the elevator in a way I had never seen a wealthy man be polite. He held the door with a small tilt of his chin, said good evening in a voice that never rose, and got off on the 22nd floor exactly 1 step behind me every single time, as if he had trained himself never to walk in front of anyone who might be nervous. He never asked what I did. He never asked why I flinched at loud voices in the lobby. He treated me the way a careful man treats a wounded animal near a fence, close enough to notice, far enough not to spook. It should have unsettled me. Instead, in the quiet violence of my new life, it began to feel like the only wall around me that was not paid for with my own money and my own fear. The trouble began the second Thursday of October. I was auditing the books of a small housing charity called Bright Corner, a client my nonprofit had inherited from a retired accountant in Oak Park, who had grown too tired to keep his own filing cabinet straight. The charity built affordable units on the west side and reported healthy quarterly numbers. On paper, the ledgers were clean. Too clean, in the way that only manicured lies are clean. When I ran the vendor list against the state contractor registry, 3 of the names came back as post office boxes rented at the same commercial mailbox on North Wabash. When I ran the mailbox address, it appeared in a filing tied to a shell company called Faro Holdings. And when I ran Faro Holdings against public property records, one of its 2 listed contact addresses was the 22nd floor of the Grain Tower Lofts. My floor. Not my apartment. Not any apartment I could name. But my floor. I sat at my kitchen counter with the printouts spread in front of me until the lake outside my window turned from black to slate to pale bronze. I did not sleep. I did not call anyone. I understood, with the flat clarity that comes only after too much coffee and too much fear, that I had 2 problems now, not 1. Preston was closing on my location from the east, and whoever Faro Holdings really was, they were sleeping 10 feet from my door. 2 hunts, converging on a woman who had chosen this floor precisely because it was supposed to be invisible. The odds of that being coincidence were the odds of a coin landing on its edge in a bank vault, and I do not believe in either. Every forensic accountant learns, in the first hard year of the job, that when 2 impossible things sit next to each other on the same page, it is almost never because the numbers are wrong. It is because someone put them there on purpose and forgot that a stranger with a calculator might one day open the file. I did not yet know who had put my floor on that page. I only knew that if I did not find out, someone else was going to find out through me. I decided that morning to test the second problem first. I told myself it was risk management. I told myself I only needed to know whether the man in 22A was the shell, or a tenant like me who had wandered into the same trap. So I did the smallest thing a forensic accountant can do when she does not want a paper trail. I baked banana bread. I wrapped a warm loaf in parchment paper, and at 7 in the evening, with the hallway lit soft and low, I knocked on the door of 22A. Matteo opened it in the same dark sweater. He looked at the loaf. He looked at me. For the first time since I had moved in, he almost smiled, and I saw the chipped tooth. He said, "You are the first person in 4 years to knock on this door who was not sent." I said I was new to the floor and only wanted to be neighborly. He said, "No, you are not." He said it without any heat, the way a man reads a receipt he already understands. Then he stepped aside and told me to come in, but only if I understood that once I did, some doors could not be closed again. The apartment was almost empty. A long walnut table, 2 low leather chairs by the window, a tall shelf of books in 3 languages, half of them non-fiction, half of them worn at the spines. No photographs anywhere, no framed diplomas, no small trophies of a life lived in public. On the counter sat a bowl of green apples and a folded newspaper open to the business section. He did not offer coffee. He said, "Whatever you came to ask it now. I am a bad liar when I am tired, and tonight I am tired." So I set the loaf on his walnut table between us, and I asked him about Faro Holdings, and I watched his eyes. The room went very still. He did not blink. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to me, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost tender. He said, "Elena, if you know that name, then either you are more dangerous than you look, or you are in more trouble than you know. I would like to help you find out which." He turned. His eyes were dark and calm, and I realized then, not unkind. He said, "But you should sit down first, because the man who signs the second contact line on Faro Holdings is me, and you have just told a stranger something that could get you killed in 11 states." I sat down, not because he told me to, because my knees decided for me before my pride could argue. And Matteo Bellondi, without ever raising his voice, without pouring a drink, without leaning across the table, began to explain the shape of the world I had walked into. He told me he had inherited a construction empire from a father who had built it on cement, favors, and quiet loans to men who could not go to banks. He told me he had spent 15 years narrowing that empire, closing the dirtiest doors his father had opened, but that some doors do not close all at once, because too many people eat behind them. Bright Corner, he said, was a legitimate charity, one of the few good things his family had ever quietly funded. Faro Holdings had once been a vehicle for laundering, retired years ago on paper, its accounts frozen and its officers dissolved. Someone was using its dormant vendor accounts again, and it was not him. Which meant that inside his own organization, someone was moving money against his will and hiding it inside a non-profit that helped grandmothers on the West Side keep their apartments through the winter. He said, "I have been looking for that person for 6 months, and a woman with your face just walked into my kitchen with the answer under her arm." I asked him what I was supposed to do with any of this. He looked at me for a long moment, longer than any man had looked at me in years without wanting something small and mean, and he said, "That depends. What are you running from?" And because I was too tired to lie and too frightened to bluff, I told him. About Preston, about the passport in the drawer, about the way he had once stood in a doorway for 20 minutes just to prove I could not walk through it, about the envelope, about the buffer that had leaked my new name. Matteo listened without moving, without interrupting, without the small performative sympathies most men offer to prove they are listening. When I finished, he said only, "Then we have both been hunted this year. Perhaps we can be useful to each other." He did not offer his hand. He did not promise safety. He asked whether I would be willing to keep auditing the Bright Corner ledgers and share what I found. And then, more gently, he asked whether I would let him put an unmarked man in the lobby for 1 week, at his expense, until we understood how close Preston already was. I told him I would think about it. I walked back to 22B, locked 3 deadbolts, and did not think. I already knew. The truth, the ugly and useful truth, was that a man who had listened to me for 1 uninterrupted hour without offering me a single easy comfort had told me more about himself than Preston had told me in 2 years of engagement. Matteo had asked no favors of me that he was not willing to trade in kind. He had shown me the shape of his own noose before asking about mine. Whatever else he was not a man who lied to save his own skin at the small end of a conversation. And after 2 years with a man who did nothing else, that alone was almost enough. That night, the tone of the story changed for me, and I want to tell you something before it changes for you. If you are still here at this point in the story, if you have not scrolled away, then you and I have a small agreement now. Please leave a comment when you get to the end, and tell me one thing. When Elena had to choose whether to trust the most dangerous man on her floor over the man who once put a ring on her finger, what would you have done? Would you have knocked on 22A a second time? Or would you have packed and run again? I want to read those answers. They will change what I write next. For 3 careful weeks, we worked in parallel. I traced the Faro vendor accounts through 6 municipal contracts, 4 of them tied to a mid-level operations manager in Matteo's own company, named Salvatore Greco. Sal, as everyone in the organization called him, had been with the family for 20 years, since before Matteo took over. He drove a modest gray sedan. He tithed to his parish. He coached a youth baseball team in Berwyn on Saturdays and brought orange slices in a cooler. He was, on paper, the last man anyone would ever suspect. Which is exactly why, as I told Matteo over a plain dinner of roast chicken and green beans in his almost empty apartment, he had chosen himself perfectly. Matteo listened, nodded once, and said, "My father hired him. My father was often wrong." He said it without bitterness, the way a man reads a weather report about a storm that has already passed over a town he used to live in. In those same 3 weeks, Preston moved closer. He hired a licensed skip tracer in Chicago, a man with a real license and a real reputation for finding women who did not wish to be found. The tracer canvassed 3 mailbox services on the north side. He filed nuisance permits on 2 buildings he did not own, hoping to trigger municipal inspections he could accompany as a courtesy walkthrough. On a Wednesday evening, Reggie the concierge called upstairs to tell me a man in a navy overcoat had asked at the front desk whether an Elena V. lived in the building, and had left a business card with the name of Preston's law firm printed in a discreet gray font. Reggie shredded the card in front of me at the desk and said, "Miss, I have been shredding cards for men like that for 20 years. You are safer than you feel." I wanted to believe him. I could not. Because I had watched Preston at close range for 2 years, and I knew that a man like him did not send a card unless he already had a second, quieter card waiting in another pocket. Matteo asked no questions when I told him. He simply said, "Then we accelerate." He did not mean the Ledger investigation. He meant Preston. He said, "You cannot outrun a developer with political friends by moving to another city. He will find the next city too, and the one after. You have to make him bankrupt or afraid. Preferably both. I can help with afraid, if you ever ask, but I will not do it uninvited. Only you can build bankrupt." He looked at me across his walnut table with the same steady calm he had shown at the very first door. He said, "You are the accountant, Elena, not me. Tell me what you can build." Something inside me shifted then, in a way I had not felt in years. Maybe not since I was a first-year associate walking into my first client meeting with a folder of numbers no one else in the room had bothered to read. For 2 years with Preston, I had been the one told what to do with my own money, my own body, my own week, my own weekend. In one sentence, Matteo had handed me back the ledger of my own life. I did not cry. I did not thank him out loud. I opened my laptop that night on his walnut table, and I began to plan. The plan took 11 days to build, and cost me most of the sleep I had left. It required a legally registered consultancy under my real name, filed with the Illinois Secretary of State on a Monday morning. It required 1 commercial bank account at a bank Preston did not use, opened in person with 2 forms of identification, and a story about starting a fresh chapter. It required a single wire agreement drafted by a plain-spoken lawyer Matteo trusted from an unrelated matter, a woman named Priya, who never once asked why. And it required a very old truth about Preston Ainsworth, one I had learned across 2 years of watching him at every dinner party he had ever hosted. He could not resist an opportunity to be admired, so I would let him find me, on my terms. I would pose as a distressed former fiancé quietly trying to unwind a joint investment we had never actually made, and I would offer him an off-the-books equity slice in a fake Chicago redevelopment fund. He would move real money into a real account under his real signature. And once he had, every wire he sent would be documented, time-stamped, and traceable back to statements he had made in writing about avoiding disclosure to his firm's partners and to the Internal Revenue Service. It would not put him in prison overnight. It would put a leash on him that his own reputation would tighten every year for the rest of his working life. Mateo listened to the whole plan without interrupting, from the bank paperwork through the wire language through the recording consent. When I finished, he said only one thing. "Where do I stand in this?" I said, "Nowhere in the paperwork, everywhere in the room." He nodded slowly. He said, "Good. Then let us also finish Sal," because the second half of the plan, the half I had not yet said aloud, was that the same fake redevelopment fund could be seeded with a small tagged sum from a dormant Faro vendor account. If Sal took the bait and rerouted the tagged money the way he had been rerouting everything else for 6 months, the trail would loop back through his personal signatures on internal Belandi accounting systems and prove, inside Mateo's organization, exactly who had betrayed him and how. 2 hunts, 1 trap, 1 woman with a spreadsheet and a very steady hand. We set the trap for the second Friday of November. I chose the date carefully. It fell 1 week before a scheduled internal audit at Preston's firm, which meant any wire he sent would sit visible in his personal ledger on the exact morning his compliance officer opened the quarterly file. It fell 3 days after the Belandi organization's quiet monthly review of vendor accounts, which meant Sal would be under pressure to close the tag transaction quickly, before anyone else could ask a question. And it fell on a Friday afternoon, when tired men make tired decisions, and tired decisions leave the cleanest fingerprints. Before I tell you what happened that Friday, I have to tell you what happened on the Thursday night before it, because I almost stopped everything. Sal, quieter than usual for 2 days, followed me from the parking garage into the lobby elevator with a small, tight smile on his mouth. He said, "Miss Vance, Mr. Belandi speaks well of you." He was polite. He was courteous. He was already inside my building. Reggie was on a scheduled break I now understood had been arranged. The elevator rose alone. Sal said, "I understand you are helping Mr. Belandi with some old paperwork. I would like to offer my help too. I know those files better than anyone still living." He was telling me, without telling me, that he knew exactly what I was doing. And I understood, standing there with my keys clenched in my palm and my back against the elevator wall, that he had chosen the elevator on purpose, because a cornered animal likes a small room and a witness with a good memory. I did not tell Mateo that night. I want you to understand why. Because if I had told him at 11, Mateo would have moved on Sal before Friday, and Preston would have kept his money and his freedom and his hunt for me for another year. I had come to Chicago to stop being rescued by men who called it protection. I made the choice, at midnight, to let Sal keep walking one more day toward my trap, instead of into Mateo's fist. It is the coldest thing I have ever done, and it is the choice I still turn over in my head some nights when I cannot sleep, because I know it means I am no longer the woman who moved into 22B, and I am not yet sure what woman I am instead. Friday came. Preston flew into Midway on a chartered plane with 2 associates, a leather portfolio, and the smug composure of a man who believed he was granting me an audience I had begged for on my knees. We met in a rented conference room in a River North co-working space that Mateo's people had wired for audio with the building owner's written consent, on a permit filed properly with the state under my consultancy's name. I wore a pale gray suit I had bought in cash the week before at a small tailor on Michigan Avenue. I let Preston kiss the air near my cheek. I let him call me sweetheart. I offered him an off-the-books slice of a Chicago redevelopment fund at a discount reserved, I told him, for people I still trusted, despite everything. He laughed the small laugh he used to celebrate himself, the one I had listened to across 100 dinners while pretending to admire it. He signed. He wired $1.2 million from a personal account tied to disclosure obligations at his firm. He explained, in his own voice, on the recording, exactly why he had chosen not to disclose it and why his partners would never need to know. And then, because he simply could not help himself, He leaned back in his chair and asked me if I had finally learned my place. I looked at him across the table. I said, "Yes, I have. It is not next to you." He left the room believing he had bought back a woman. He had bought a rope, and he had tied every knot himself. That same afternoon, in a warehouse office in Cicero, Sal received a routine internal request to move a small vendor payment from a Faro account into what he believed was a legitimate contractor slot for a new West Side rehabilitation project. The request was drafted the way he liked, on the older internal form, with the older internal codes. The account he chose to route it through was one only he had signature access to. The amount was tagged and traceable to a specific origin invoice. The signature was his. Matteo watched the confirmation come through on a laptop in his almost empty apartment, drank a single small glass of water, and stood up from the walnut table. He did not go to Cicero himself. He sent 2 of his oldest lieutenants and a lawyer, and he told them plainly, "No blood. He walks out on his feet, and he never touches this family again." When he told me later exactly what he had said in that call, I understood something about him I had been slow to see. Matteo Bellondi was not a man who wanted to be feared. He was a man who wanted to be finished with the parts of himself his father had chosen for him. The rest of Friday night I spent on the floor of my living room with my laptop, sending the recorded conversation and the wire documentation, under my real legal name, to a former colleague at the Federal Financial Crimes Unit in Washington, who had once offered me a job I had turned down for Preston. Her name was Diane. I had not spoken to her in 3 years. I attached a plain letter. I said I was not asking for prosecution. I was asking for a file, opened, in Preston Ainsworth's name, that would live in the system for the rest of his career, and that any partner, any client, any state or federal regulator could request through the appropriate channels. I said I would testify if needed. I said I would not run again. I hit send at 11:42 at night, closed the laptop, and for the first time in 3 years, I slept without stacking a chair against my own front door. Preston understood by Sunday. He understood the way men like him always understand, not through remorse, but through calculation of cost against benefit against reputation. His lawyer called me on a Monday morning to inform me, in the careful voice lawyers use when they have already lost, that his client would be withdrawing all inquiries into my current residence, would be voluntarily transferring the disputed $1.2 million into a Chicago Women's Shelter Fund as a gesture of goodwill, and would prefer that our respective files remain, in his lawyer's phrase, quietly filed. I told the lawyer that I accepted the transfer and rejected the phrase. I said, "The file stays open. That is the point." I hung up. I stood in my kitchen. I did not cry. I made a cup of plain black tea and watched the steam rise. And then I walked across the hall and knocked on 22A one more time. If you have made it this far with me, please do one small thing before the last scene. Tap subscribe. Not because I am asking loudly, but because you are the kind of listener who stays for the ending. And stories like this one are only written when listeners like you make them worth writing. Thank you. Now let me tell you what happened at Matteo's door. Matteo opened it in the same dark sweater. There was a small cut on his knuckle that had not been there on Friday, and a faint bruise along the outside edge of his hand. He looked tired the way men look tired only when a long thing has finally ended, and the silence afterward is louder than the fight. I stepped inside. I did not bring bread this time. I brought a folded page from the Tribune, an announcement of a federal consulting board opening in the Chicago field office. A seat Diane had quietly nudged toward me a week earlier, and I had not yet answered. I set it on the walnut table between us. I said, "I am going to take it." He read the announcement carefully, all the way to the bottom, the way he read everything. He nodded once. He said, "Good. You should not spend the rest of your life hiding across a hallway from a man like me." I told him I did not think of him that way anymore, and I meant it, and I was also afraid of how much I meant it. Because the truth was that in 3 months I had come to know the man in 22, better than I had known the man I almost married, and the arithmetic of that fact was something I was not yet ready to sit with in daylight. He said quietly that he was glad, and that he would like it to stay true, which meant we would have to be careful with each other. He said he had begun the paperwork that afternoon to formally dissolve two of the older arms of his organization, the ones his father had built, and he had inherited without asking for. He said it would take years, not weeks, and that some of the men who worked for him would not forgive him for it. He said he did not expect me to wait for the years. He asked only that he be allowed to take me to a plain dinner at a plain restaurant 3 blocks away. Not tonight, but on some Sunday when we both had nothing else to prove and no one else to save. I said yes. I said only yes. I did not move out of 22B. I did not move in with him. I took the federal seat that Wednesday, and I signed the ethics paperwork with my real name printed at the top for the first time in a long time. I kept my own door and my own key and my own quiet mornings. Twice a month, on a Sunday, Matteo and I walked the 4 blocks to a small Italian place on Erie Street, sat across from each other at a table by the window, and talked about nothing dangerous. He told me about the 2 arms he was slowly closing and the men he was retiring with generous pensions so they would not need to earn anything the hard way ever again. I told him about the cases I was building on white-collar predators who thought a nice suit was armor. We did not touch across the table for a long time. When we finally did, months later, it was his hand under mine, not the other way around, and even then, only for a moment, and neither of us said a word about it afterward. Preston Ainsworth returned to New York with a file the size of a house, sitting quietly in a federal drawer with his name on it. Every year, at his firm's compliance review, that file will surface. Every year, a partner will ask him about a wire he sent to a woman in Chicago in November. Every year, a small, cold thing will happen to a man who used to lock passports in drawers. It is not prison. It is better than prison. It is a leash he tied himself, in his own ink, in his own hand, and I hold the other end, without ever having to pick it up or pull. Salvatore Greco disappeared from the Belandi organization on the following Monday. He was not harmed. He was, by every account I have been given, driven to a bus station in Gary, Indiana, with a small envelope of cash and a very short conversation, and told never to enter the state of Illinois again, for any reason, for any funeral. I do not know where he is now. I do not want to know. I only know that the money he redirected has been quietly returned, over the course of a year, to Bright Corner, and that 3 more grandmothers on the west side kept their apartments through the winter because of it, and that when I visited the charity last spring to close out the audit, one of them baked me a lemon cake and did not ask my name. And me? I still live in apartment 22B, on the 22nd floor of the Grain Tower Lofts on Lake Michigan. Reggie still works the night desk and still shreds any business card I do not want to see, and last Christmas I gave him a fountain pen because he had never owned one. My deadbolts have gone from 3 to 1. I open the blinds at sunrise now most mornings, and I let the light in without checking the street first. I bake banana bread when I am nervous and give it away when I am not. On some evenings, when the elevator chimes on my floor and stops, I hear a quiet step in the corridor, and I know without looking that Matteo is walking 1 pace behind me, still, out of habit, out of care, out of a kind of love neither of us is in any hurry to name aloud. I do not turn around every time, but when I do, he is always there, and for the first time in my adult life, the sound of a footstep behind me does not mean I have to run. I came to Chicago to hide from a man who thought he owned me. I found, across a hallway, a man who has spent his whole life learning not to own anyone. Between those 2 truths, quietly, 1 Sunday dinner at a time, 1 federal case file at a time, 1 loaf of bread at a time, I built the rest of my life. And if you have listened this far, you already know the last thing I want to say, so I will say it plainly, and then I will let you go. The most dangerous man on my floor turned out to be the safest door I ever knocked on. And the safest man in my old life turned out to be the door I should never have opened. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me in the comments which door in your own life you are still trying to decide about, and I will read every single one. I always do. I always will.